Hi, welcome back. In this tutorial we're going to follow on with making our drum kit from the sliced beatbox sample, and we're going to make a closed hi-hat. We'll look at the open hi-hat in the next tutorial, and we would probably do this the other way around if we were using a different method for creating these sounds, say for example using operator or analog as a way of synthesizing these drum sounds, because it's a bit more of an exact science when you use synthesis. You know, you can use particular waveforms, and so with a hi-hat you can pretty much make the open hi-hat first and then just shorten it and get your closed hi-hat. But for this we're using slices of audio recordings that are a little bit less precise, and so I'm going to use two separate slices of the sample in order to create our closed hi-hat and open hi-hat. So there's basically two separate tutorials. And for the closed hi-hat, this is going to be one of the most straightforward tutorials, simply because there's a slice already in this rack that already sounds like a closed hi-hat that I would actually use. So what we're going to do is go through all the slices and we'll find one that sounds like a good hi-hat to start working on. Actually, before we even got onto that, I'm going to have to fix a problem. And that is, I haven't been naming things as I go along. Now, I cannot stress how important it is to name as you go, because you can get up to 128 chains in a drum rack, and you can imagine if they're all called things like slice 23 and slice 67, then it's going to make it a nightmare to figure out what's going on. And it's so easy to just forget, especially when you start with slices. And the same applies for tracks, instruments, basically everything in your set. It'll just make life so much easier if you name as you go. So let's just rename this drum kit, and it's Control R on the PC or Command R on Mac. Slice 1 was our kick. Slice 5 was clap. Well, we could call that snare really, but we'll call it clap. And we'll name the track as well. Okay, well, so if we just go through the other slices, I see that we could almost use as a hi-hat, but it's not really quite there. I mean, any of these we could probably use with a bit of work, but if we go to slice 6, that is perfect. That, in fact, already sounds like a hi-hat that I would use. So we'll rename that closed hi-hat. And then the next thing I'm going to do is change our little looping note repeater that helps us trigger the clip without having to keep pressing it. So that now that'll keep playing while we start to edit it. Now, like I said, I would use that as a closed hi-hat already, but you can make it a lot more versatile and usable in a lot more different situations just by applying a high-pass filter. And starting at somewhere around 1 kHz, you can pretty much sweep through the frequencies and shape it to the way you want it. Now, this is something I'd like to really encourage in these tutorials. I don't want to give any hard and fast rules, like to make a hi-hat you need to boost this frequency or anything like that. Really, the whole point of mixing is to take lots of different sounds and make them fit together. So really, you don't want to be loading up presets and just leaving them as they are, because you might load up a hi-hat that sounds great on its own, but as soon as you put it in the mix with some other sounds, it doesn't sound that good anymore. And that might be because the main frequencies that work about that hi-hat are being taken up by some other sound in the mix. So it's a really good idea to sort of think of your sounds as fluid and constantly changing, so that as soon as you start adding sounds or changing other sounds, then you want to be able to change this sound. And really what we're looking at here is just how much a simple high-pass filter can change the way a hi-hat works in a mix. So if we just take the clip that we were using in the clap tutorial and add a hi-hat to it, just so we can hear it in context. So if we just add a hi-hat to that using the pen tool, you can access that with draw mode as well here, or you can use Control B on a PC or Command B on a Mac to enable the draw tool. I'm just going to stick a and just sweep through the frequency range of the high pass filter and see what sounds good. And you'll notice as you turn the frequency up, the volume will get quieter, so you might need to adjust the volume of the simpler. See, that sounds better already. So let's just try a saturator and then we'll go for a compressor afterwards. And I always use the soft clip because it prevents it going above 0 dB, so it's a little safety catch. Turn the output down a bit. Turn the driver. So saturator is pretty good for hi-hats, maybe on the medium curve. Or even hard curve. Maybe try the dry wet down a little bit so that it stick with the medium curve for now. Maybe even turn it a bit higher. And now we'll add a compressor as well, just to even the sound out a bit. And you can see just by making these few changes, that gives us a lot more flexibility. You can play around with some of the settings on the saturator, and we'll go over the saturator in another tutorial in more detail. And you'll see that just by playing with some of the settings on saturator, you can make a big difference to things like hi-hats. But we're not going to go too in-depth in that now. You can have a bit of a play if you want to. But really, we're just looking at the types of things that will change your hi-hat and make it more usable. So another one is the reverb gate that we used on the clap. Now you'll notice when I turned that up, that it's created a bit of a rhythm, that kind of quite a nice effect there. That's because if we look at the gate, then we've now got the clap and the hi-hat opening that gate. So it's created that kind of interesting effect where the reverb is basically playing a rhythm. Now that's quite interesting and quite usable. You might want to actually use something like that. But I'd rather have this independent control so we can choose whether or not to do that. So we'll turn that one down. We can always turn it up at another time. But we'll just give the hi-hat its own reverb. And a gate. Just turn the gate off for the moment. And turn that up. I'm going to turn the size down a bit. I'm going to put a low cut on that. I'll also stick the dry wet up because we're using it as a send effect. So we don't need any of the dry signal because we've already got the dry signal here on this chain. So I'll stick the gate on. So we just might want a little bit less of that. Actually, we'll turn it up here so that it's going through the gate and keeping it open. We'll just turn this down a bit. There we go. So if we want that other rhythmic effect, we'll just turn that up. So you could then automate that and then bring it in just for a bar. quite a nice effect actually, and I reckon that'd be well worth automating and using within a track. Okay, well you can see how much we've done to this hi-hat just by changing the filter and adding some saturator, compressor, reverb and gate. Now if we have a look at the envelope settings, and of course we're going to have to go and unmap all these from the macros again like we did in the last couple of tutorials. And again I'm going to turn the sustain right down. In fact I probably didn't need to really unmap anything but sustain and decay, but we may as well do all of them. Now if we trigger this clip again and start tweaking the decay, and here just pulling the decay back probably sounds quite familiar. A lot of hi-hats have a decay that short. You might notice when we've got it that short that it affects the gate a little bit, so might just turn the send up a little bit and then the overall volume of the return track down a bit. So just playing with the decay settings can make quite a big difference. But if we're now going to have a look at the loop settings, again we have to unmap all the knobs from the macros. So if we just switch on the loop button and we just pull the loop and length settings back a bit, turn the fade up. Fade makes it a bit smoother. Let's just solo this so we can hear what we're doing. Have to turn the decay up a bit so we can hear it. So you can see when we make it really tight, it can make it sound really artificial, but if we pull the decay back, that can be quite a nice effect, and a little bit reminiscent of some of the older drum machines. But probably the most useful for your kind of general hi-hat might be just to take a bit of the end tail of the natural decay of the sample and loop a bit of that. Just gives us a little bit more length to the actual sample. But we're going to go over these loop settings more in the open hi-hat tutorial. Okay, well now just one last thing I want to look at is for those who have the sampler instrument, and if you do, you can just go simpler to sampler in the context menu, just like we did in the clap tutorial, just by enabling the OSC button and setting it to the noise waveform. Just turning the volume up a bit. The envelope isn't having too much effect on it with these settings. If we change the waveform, maybe to sine, turn the coarse up a bit, you can hear the pitch change a little bit. Maybe try triangle. Just solo it so we can hear what we're doing. Try sine again. And there we go, add a bit more decay. You can sort of hear what's in there. Just adds a little bit of colour to the sound of it. Makes it sound a little bit more metallic. Quite loud now, so we might need to pull it down a bit. That's adding a lot to the volume. But it's giving a quite nice sort of synthetic hi-hat sound. So that can be useful as well. Okay, well that's basically it. We've looked at a lot of different things we can do there to make a pretty ordinary sound a lot more usable and versatile. And if we go back and have a look at this original sound that we used, that clap sound there, we used the tail end of. If we trigger that quickly, Well, actually, we've changed that a bit too much now to really see, but it's kind of a bit like a bit of white noise. And if we were trying to create a hi-hat using synthesis, then we'd probably use some white noise and maybe pass it through a bandpass filter. And that's what some of the older drum machines did for hi-hats. But if you could then consider something like the Roland TR-909, which is one of the most popular drum machines, then that actually used samples of real hi-hats and cymbals, just sampled at a very low bit rate. So if you were trying to recreate that kind of hi-hat, and this applies probably more to open hi-hats than closed hi-hats, then you'd be better off probably using samples from a sample library. But as we've seen here, for a closed hi-hat we can do a surprising amount just by changing a filter and adding a few effects. Okay, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.